For my 18th birthday, my grandparents surprised me with an amazing gift, a trip to New Zealand, complete with a flight ticket and a check for expenses. It was an incredible opportunity, especially since I'm planning to major in literature and New Zealand's rich history would be perfect for my studies. However, the joy was short-lived. My parents began insisting I hand over the trip to my older sister, Ellie, who's 20 and the family's golden child. They argued that as a project architect, Ellie would benefit more from the architectural wonders of New Zealand during her vacation. It's important to note that when Ellie turned 18, she had the chance for a similar trip but opted for the money instead. Despite my protests and the fact that airline policies generally don't allow ticket transfers except in emergencies, my parents were relentless. After days of emotional pressure and arguments that dredged up all they had done for me, I caved. They claimed they wanted to avoid wasting the trip, a statement that stung deeply, as it implied my going would be a waste. Feeling hurt and weary of the constant conflict, I decided to let them have their way, at least to keep the peace, and because I thought ticket transfers weren't possible. Yet, in a twist of fate, on the day of the flight, Ellie had an accident on her way to the airport. Seeing an unexpected chance to reclaim what was originally mine, I took back the ticket and headed to New Zealand, eager to embrace the adventure that awaited. According to the airline's guidelines, which I had thoroughly reviewed, I didn't think my family could transfer the ticket, but somehow they had managed to bypass those rules. Yesterday, when I was supposed to be on my way to the airport, my sister Ellie ended up with my boarding pass instead. While she was en route, our family received a distressing call from the police. They informed us that there had been an accident involving Ellie. She had impulsively tried to steer the taxi herself, distrusting the driver's route and anxious about missing her flight. This reckless act caused them to crash into a tree. Miraculously, Ellie escaped with minor scratches, but the taxi driver wasn't as fortunate. The impact was severe on his side, resulting in a broken arm and a deep gash on his forehead that required numerous stitches. He decided to press charges against Ellie for her role in the accident. Now, my parents faced the possibility of using their life savings to bail her out and settle with the cab driver to avoid a trial. When I learned about the accident, I blurted out that it was karma for how they had pressured me to give up my trip. The words slipped out in the heat of the moment, and I instantly regretted them. My parents were shocked and scolded me, saying that such a situation was no joking matter. They told me that once spoken, words couldn't be taken back, and now they saw me as selfish. This accusation stung, especially since they had previously insisted the trip would be wasted on me. I tried to remind them of their own harsh words, but they refused to engage with me further and left for the hospital. Angered and frustrated by the hypocrisy and constant undervaluation, I made a snap decision. Why should I sacrifice my happiness for a family that would never appreciate me? I hastily packed some essentials, called a cab, and followed my parents to the hospital. When I arrived, I found Ellie still talking to the police, trying to deflect blame. I approached her to ask about the boarding pass. She was disoriented, perhaps from the shock and the events at the hospital. Seizing the moment, I rummaged through her purse, found the boarding pass, and, without a word, took it back. I was determined to reclaim my trip and experience life on my own terms, far from the drama and the constant undermining at home. In a whirlwind of confusion and determination, I made a dash back to the cab and sped off towards the airport. I barely made it in time, slipping into my seat on the flight just before takeoff. As the plane lifted off, I was finally on my way to New Zealand, distancing myself from the drama unfolding back home. I kept my phone off during the flight, disconnecting from any incoming messages or calls. It wasn't until I landed in New Zealand that I turned my phone back on and discovered a slew of messages detailing just how upset my family was with me. My parents accused me of being insensitive, given that Ellie had just been in a significant accident, one she caused, though they seemed to conveniently overlook that detail. Meanwhile, Ellie felt betrayed, believing I had snatched this opportunity from her, despite the fact that she had initially taken it from me. The irony was lost on no one. The consensus among my family was clear. They believed I had acted wrongly and expected an apology from me. Ellie also mentioned in her messages that our parents would now need to dip into their savings to settle with the taxi driver. This made me reflect on whether I should have stayed and supported my family financially instead of indulging in this trip. I found myself grappling with feelings of guilt, wondering if my actions were indeed selfish. People have asked for more clarity on certain points, so let me explain a bit more. Regarding the boarding pass and the ticket transfer, it seems there was no real plan from Ellie or my parents. They probably hoped to figure things out at the airport, which inadvertently worked in my favor when I reclaimed my boarding pass. As for why I hadn't chosen to live with my grandparents or move away from my family's toxic environment, it's complicated. I've grown accustomed to this treatment over the years. While it's far from acceptable, it fostered in me a hope that by doing better, I might finally earn their approval, though this was a misplaced and self-sacrificial belief. Despite the repeated disappointments and emotional strain, a part of me still clung to the hope of winning their affection, a sentiment many children can relate to when dealing with familial favoritism. Additionally, my grandparents live far from the city, away from everything I know. The idea of moving in with them, while seemingly a solution, felt like stepping into an entirely new world, one I was not prepared to navigate alone. Thus, despite everything, I stayed, tethered by a mix of hope, familiarity, and an underlying loyalty to my family. Now, here in New Zealand, away from it all, I ponder these decisions, wondering if the distance might finally offer me a new perspective on what family and self-worth really mean. Despite having considered it many times, I never wanted to drastically change my life by moving away to live with my grandparents. They, along with everyone else outside our immediate family, are unaware of how my parents treat me. We're skilled at keeping up appearances, which made it hard for me to think about leaving. However, now that I'm an adult, I realize that I don't need to keep trying to please others at the expense of my own happiness. As for my relationship with my sister, Ellie, we've never been close. There's no animosity, we simply don't connect. She's always been the one in the passenger seat, both literally during family road trips and metaphorically in life. Her need for control was vividly illustrated when she grabbed the steering wheel from her cab driver, thinking she knew a better route to the airport, which led to the accident. Financially, our family is on the lower end of the income spectrum. My mom is an executive assistant and my dad is a drill team coach, and they often rely on financial help from my grandparents. The current situation with the cab driver and the legal issues might force them to be more transparent with my grandparents about their actions. Many have asked why Ellie was in the passenger seat of the cab, and honestly, it seems to be out of habit and perhaps her controlling nature. She left for the airport nearly 3 hours early, which shows her anxiety about control and planning. After pondering over the situation for a few days, I decided to fully embrace and enjoy my trip to New Zealand. This might be one of the last opportunities for such an adventure before college and adult responsibilities take hold. My family are all adults. They can manage their own affairs without my intervention. It's not my fault they tried to claim something that wasn't theirs and faced the consequences. I've also taken a big step by discussing my home situation with my grandparents, the first time I've opened up to anyone about the partiality and mistreatment I faced growing up. Even my closest friends were unaware. Sharing this with my grandparents was liberating. They were shocked and supportive, validating my feelings and experiences. This conversation has shown me the importance of voicing my struggles and not bearing them silently. Now, I'm focusing on making the most of my time in New Zealand, exploring, learning, and living life to the fullest. For a long time, I kept my struggles to myself, believing that if I continued to be the obedient daughter, my parents would eventually recognize and appreciate my efforts. However, after opening up to my grandparents, it became painfully clear that this recognition would never come. During our conversation, they were incredibly supportive and made it clear that they wanted me to live with them after my trip to New Zealand. They even offered to cover all my college expenses since I'd chosen an out-of-state college. This was a huge relief, especially since my parents had previously stated they couldn't fund my education, having already paid for my sister Ellie's college, leaving me to fend for myself. The clarity and support from my grandparents were all I needed to turn my life around. With their help, I wouldn't have to worry about my living situation upon returning from New Zealand. Given the tension with my parents who were clearly upset with my decisions, I doubted a warm welcome back home. When my trip ended a few days ago, I moved straight into my grandparents' house. They had prepared the guest room for me, and to my surprise, they had already moved my belongings from my parents' house. My grandparents welcomed me warmly, a stark contrast to the environment I had left. They told me they had confronted my parents about the long-standing mistreatment I'd endured. This confrontation coincided with a discussion about the accident involving Ellie, as my parents were desperate to avoid using their savings for a hefty settlement with the taxi driver, given the looming threat of a trial amplified by dashcam footage of Ellie causing the accident. My grandparents' visit to my parents was initially intended to discuss the financial aid for Ellie's situation. However, they prioritized addressing the unfair treatment I had received throughout my life. At first, my parents tried to deflect the conversation to focus solely on Ellie's legal troubles, but my grandparents persisted, forcing them to acknowledge their behavior towards me. This bold move by my grandparents was a turning point, ensuring that my voice was heard and my grievances acknowledged. Now, living with my grandparents, I feel a sense of security and validation that was absent in my previous home. I am grateful for their unconditional support and am looking forward to starting this new chapter of my life under their care, away from the unfair pressures of my past. While I was in New Zealand living what felt like the best days of my life, it seemed unnecessary to dwell on the unresolved issues back home. However, my grandparents, wanting to address and understand the full extent of the situation, insisted on discussing it. During this conversation, my parents eventually admitted that they believed I deserved the treatment I had received because, according to them, I had abandoned my family during a crisis. They claimed my actions at the hospital where I retrieved my flight ticket and left for my trip showed that I was indifferent to Ellie's accident and the family's distress. They even accused me of being jealous of Ellie, asserting that she had always outperformed me in everything, and therefore my feelings of neglect were unfounded. My parents described me as entitled and spoiled and declared they were done indulging such behavior. Upon hearing this, my grandparents made a decisive move to distance themselves and me from this toxic environment. They argued with my parents, who then coldly suggested that if my grandparents were so concerned, they should take me with them. My grandparents didn't hesitate. They arranged to move my belongings to their home, making it clear that they were now my primary support system. After arriving back and settling into my new home with my grandparents, they recounted the entire ordeal. Hearing how readily my parents had dismissed me was heartbreaking. Despite knowing deep down that my parents had never truly supported or understood me, it was still a painful realization that they were all I had known for 19 years. The whole situation made me incredibly emotional. I was devastated yet grateful that my grandparents stood by me through everything. Now, I have no illusions about where I stand. I'm living with my grandparents, and this is my new home. They have promised to support me not just emotionally but financially as well, covering all my college expenses. Since returning, I haven't been in contact with my parents or Ellie. I had avoided checking my messages during my trip to keep myself from falling into a worse mental state. Today, I felt strong enough to look at those messages, and unsurprisingly, they were filled with accusations of selfishness and entitlement from Ellie. She expressed relief at no longer having to deal with me, which ironically mirrored my feelings towards her. At this point, the hurtful words from my parents don't even shock me anymore. It's a sad reflection of our entire relationship. But now, with my grandparents' unwavering support, I feel secure and ready to move forward. The toxicity that once overshadowed my daily life is behind me, and I'm focusing on building a future where I am valued and loved, far away from the negativity that once consumed me. After my trip to New Zealand, I received a few messages from my parents criticizing my actions as heartless. They expressed regret for not intervening when I rushed to the hospital to retrieve my boarding pass, suggesting that their failure in raising me properly allowed me to act impulsively. They lamented that despite providing a comfortable life ensuring I was fed, clothed, and educated, I still found reasons to complain about my upbringing. They accused me of jealousy towards my sister Ellie and unjustly casting them as villains. Their harshest words declared that they viewed me as a waste of their time and effort, and they were relieved to be rid of me. These messages hurt deeply, but I had resolved, after talking with my grandparents, not to let their harsh words affect me anymore. So, I blocked them to prevent any further emotional harm and decided it was time to start my healing journey, aiming to move past the trauma and live my best life, though I knew it would be challenging. 3 weeks after returning from my trip, I still hadn't heard anything about my parents or Ellie's situation with the cab driver. I assumed they were still grappling with how to settle the matter financially. Then, unexpectedly, my parents showed up at my grandparents' house. They ignored me as they entered and made their way to the living room. Caught off guard, I lingered awkwardly, but my grandparents motioned for me to join the discussion. Their presence at the table was a clear signal that they supported me, regardless of my parents' likely displeasure. As we all sat down, the tension was palpable. My grandparents initiated the conversation by asking my parents the purpose of their unexpected visit, given that their last interaction had been strained. My parents, maintaining their stern demeanor, began to discuss their current predicament. They were still struggling to gather the funds needed for an out-of-court settlement with the cab driver, who was demanding a substantial amount due to the accident. Throughout this discussion, I remained silent, observing the dynamics and noting how my grandparents handled the situation with a calm and firm stance, reinforcing their commitment to protect and support me in this family crisis. This situation underscored a new chapter in my life, where I no longer lived under my parents' shadow, but was supported by my grandparents, who provided a safe and affirming environment. It was a poignant reminder that while moving on from familial trauma is difficult, it is possible with the right support and personal resolve. When my parents arrived at my grandparents' house, the atmosphere was tense. They made it clear they wanted nothing more to do with my grandparents because they were supporting my decisions. However, before severing ties completely, my parents claimed they had some financial matters to settle. They presented a document detailing the substantial amount of money they claimed to have spent on raising me, asserting that since my grandparents had taken on parental responsibilities, they should now reimburse them almost $200,000. The audacity of the demand left me speechless. It seemed a desperate attempt to diminish us. My grandparents excused themselves to discuss the situation privately, leaving me in an uncomfortable silence with my parents, who pointedly ignored my presence. When my grandparents returned, they maintained their composure. My grandfather stated they would accept the responsibility and repay the amount my parents had spent on me. I was about to protest, feeling this was unjust since my parents were merely fulfilling their obligations, not doing me a favor. However, my grandparents silenced me with a gesture, then proposed a condition. They would pay, but only if my parents repaid every penny they had borrowed over the years from them. The response caught my parents off guard. The look on their faces was one of total surprise, akin to deer caught in headlights. Unable to contain my amusement at their predicament, I excused myself to avoid bursting into laughter. I stayed in my room until after my parents had left. Curious about the outcome, I later learned from my grandparents that my parents had tried to argue, but found themselves cornered by the logic of the situation. In the end, they left angrily, cursing, and clearly humiliated. My grandparents assured me that they wouldn't likely return anytime soon after this debacle. This incident reinforced my belief that leaving for New Zealand had been the right decision. Now, with my departure for college on the horizon, I am looking forward to starting a new chapter. The support from my grandparents has been unwavering, and their ability to handle my parents' antics has proven that they are more than capable of protecting both me and themselves. The fact that my father is their only son does not soften their resolve. They stand firm in their principles. As for me, I am just excited to embrace the future, grateful for the freedom and support to pursue my dreams.